Chapter 7 basically covers 1946 to 1954, post-war era, and it starts out basically talking about how disposable income is now actually a thing, where people weren't just living just to save money or whatever, but they were actually spending money on more frivolous things, and more importantly, young people had disposable income. This was when people started, or kids started finally getting allowances. This was actually a new thing. The music of the time were after the big band era, and a lot of popular music was more romantic, crooning music with occasionally the fun song. Page 200 in your book has a long list of songs that are popular at the time, and you might recognize some of those. There's a huge surge of conservatism in the U.S. for a while, but that kind of changes. The big thing, if you'll remember, we had the your hit parade earlier. Now we have top 40 programming, which is in the United States and the radio stations. And a big thing that happens around this time, and it will be covered in a later chapter also, is the payola scandal, which was just basically people paying off DJs to play their records to get them famous, even if they weren't famous. Just basically bribing DJs, and this became a huge lawsuit and in the courts for a long time, and it got a lot of people fired and even put in prison for it. You should read about that, though. Then also the idea that large corporations are indeed, as always, trying to take over all the independent labels that are cropping up at this time because things are going well. But large corporations still tend to win out. Technology of this time is pretty interesting because we're starting to see the first time the use of magnetic tape, things that later on will become 8-tracks and cassettes. This is new, and the nice thing about tape recording is in some ways it's better. It has a better audio range. You get a better sound, and you can re-record things, and you can overdub, and you can do some little interesting things. It's not cheaper. It's huge back then. It was the machinery was very cumbersome, but it had some definite advantages, but mostly audio and recording in nature. 1948, Les Paul was the guitarist, was very instrumental in a lot of this too. That's an interesting thing for some of you. 1948 was the first tape recorder. And then in 1949, we have experiments in stereo as opposed to mono. And we're slowly switching from AM radio to FM radio, and that's mainly because it's showing up in cars now. TV, the first one, and this is always hard for me to believe, the first TV was presented in 1939 at the World's Fair in New York. So this is still a very new thing. It is becoming more popular, but like all new technology, not everybody owns a high-def 4K TV nowadays, but 5 years from now, I imagine almost everybody will. Just the way it goes. So we have the rise of the big singers. These are actually singers like Frank Sinatra. It's got his start as just being a backup singer in a big band, but when the big band declined and wasn't so much, he used to be in the Tommy Dorsey band. When it declined, he basically just got his own solo gig, and he and many others became the more popular singers of the time. He was basically Frank Sinatra, the first superstar. Many of you probably know of him, especially after he became a popular movie star. Read about him a little bit. Nat King Cole, please listen to his voice. It is something that I'd hate for you to miss. He's one of my favorite voices. He's also very interesting because he was the first African-American crossover artist, first black musician to have his own radio show, and the first one to have a TV show. That's just amazing. And part of that is just because how talented he is, too. Because this is not exactly the most friendly time for that kind of a thing. We have other singers at this era. I don't think it's listed on the slides, but it's Perry Como, Doris Day, Peggy Lee. These are all famous. You should read about that a little bit. Again, remember about the decline of the big band era. It's also covered in Chapter 7 a little bit. We also have a new style of music that is starting to surface called urban folk music, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's not country, but it's a little bit more folksy, but it comes from the cities. Pete Seeger and the Weavers is probably the most influential and famous of them all. There's some listening to that, and I'll bet some of you have heard some of that music also. It's folksy, but it's more intellectual. Nowadays, think Bob Dylan or Mumford and Sons. They're still around and they're still doing stuff. Typically, a lot of it's political music too. And there's Peter, Paul, and Mary also. That's another group. And again, they did a lot of political type music. Um, Going on then, the Latin stream, the mambo craze is what comes up from about 1949 to 55. You'll have musicians like Perez Prado, and the mambo was just a thing. Think disco. It's like the precursor to disco, and then later on house or techno music. Listen to Mambo Number 5 gives you a pretty good idea about that. Southern music after the war. We're now starting to change labels. It's no longer going to be called hillbilly music. It is now switching to country and western music. And what used to be called race records is now being rebranded as R&B. And it's still that way now. This would include things like jump bands, and let me move the slide a bit and see if we have this covered a little bit. Okay, yeah. R&B started again in like about 1949, and a jump band, think of it as a precursor to like a rock and roll band. It's like a tiny big band. It's basically got one trumpet maybe and one saxophone and drums and guitar and whatnot. So, but they're not going to just do jazzy music. They're going to do Tin Pan Alley type songs, love songs, urban blues, gospel, harmony type stuff. So it's not a single type of music, but it is a single kind of a type of group of musicians just doing this exactly what it sounds like, very up tempo, bouncy stuff. Louis Jordan, sorry, and probably some people consider him the first rock and roll musician. You can make up your own mind about that if you want to, but a lot of his music that he did perform later on was covered by rock and roll musicians like Bill Haley and the Comets, and slightly different, but it's the same song. And so that's kind of why he sometimes is given the credit for that, especially his song Choo Choo Chiboogie, which is on your listening also. Charlie Brown's another musician, but he's Texas born, classical pianist, graduated college at 20, moved to LA. But he went more the crooner style. And if you listen to his song Black Knight, you'll see what the difference is between that. We have all sorts of different styles coming in. We have the Chicago Electric Blues with Muddy Waters, real popular with the Rolling Stones. They actually got their names because Muddy Waters, one of his songs, was called that. Um, Muddy Waters is rougher, grittier. Chicago has that electric sound. He moved from Mississippi, but like a lot of musicians in the Delta, they moved up north to Chicago to get work. And let me see, bottleneck slide guitar sound that if you'll listen to his song Hoochie Coochie Man, you'll see what I'm talking about with that. We still have our vocal harmony groups at this time, including the Dominoes, and then other singular artists. You'll enjoy listening to Ruth Brown and Big Mama Thornton because especially Big Mama Thornton, she did the original cover for Hound Dog, which was later covered by Elvis Presley. Take a look at them, read their biographies a little bit so that you know a little bit about them because they'll be talked about on the test. And then we have a section of the book that goes at the same time period talking about country and western music. The big areas are, as always, Nashville and Tennessee, but also Southern California. These are major producing eras. Again, many famous musicians of popular music, like Bing Crosby and Tony Bennett, are doing country and western music because it is very popular. Read about Patti Page. She is born and raised in Oklahoma. She is considered the most successful female singer of the 1950s. Her big song was Tennessee Waltz and How Much Is That Doggy in the Window? Just one of the most popular singers in the world at the time. One of the first 45s, if you don't know what a 45 is, it's not a gun, it's a record. Take a look at that. And she used multi-track recording on her. She actually sang a duet with herself because of magnetic tape. And was a little bit of a crooner, but definitely honky-tonk singer. You have other types of country and western at this time, including country crooners, Eddie Arnold, bluegrass singers, Bill Monroe, honky-tonk singers like Ernest Tubb and Hank Williams Sr. You cannot talk enough about Hank Williams Sr., and you should read that chapter or that part of the chapter about him and his music and listen to the songs that are in there. He is considered I don't know what you would call it, but he's considered the seminal person of early country and western music, and almost everybody in this business reveres him as that special person. But that's pretty much covers the country and western section. Just take a look at it and definitely listen to each one of the songs because they're very specific.